Sometimes, life strips away everything you thought defined you, leaving only the man you truly are. Jake Morrison stood in that dusty frontier town with empty pockets and a heart, full of dreams that seemed foolish to everyone watching. The auction crowd laughed when he approached Thunder, a massive draft horse that towered over every other animal. This wasn't a cowboy's horse. It was a giant beast meant for heavy work, with wild eyes that had thrown every rider who tried. Jake had barely enough coins for a decent meal, much less a proper horse. But when Thunder looked at him across that corral, something passed between them that money couldn't buy. The townspeople roared with laughter as Jake placed his small bid on the horse nobody wanted. They thought they were watching a broken man make his final mistake. But what happened next would change everything they believed about courage and partnership. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Clearwater Junction, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. Jake Morrison sat on the porch of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, rolling his father's silver spurs between calloused fingers. The metal was worn smooth in places, testimony to decades of honest work on horseback. These spurs were all he had, left of the man who'd raised him to believe that a cowboy's worth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the respect he earned from both beast and fellow man. 3 months had passed since Jake arrived in this frontier town with nothing but the clothes on his back and memories of the drought that had claimed everything. The Circle M Ranch, where he'd worked since boyhood, had withered under the merciless Arizona sun. Cattle died by the hundreds, their bones bleaching white in pastures that had once been green. The bank had foreclosed on his employer's land, and Jake had found himself adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for a man whose only skills involved horses and cattle. Clearwater Junction wasn't much to look at, a collection of wooden buildings that had sprouted around a natural spring, serving travelers and settlers heading west. Main Street stretched barely 3 blocks, lined with the essentials of frontier life: a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and a small church whose bell tower reached hopefully toward the sky. The town existed because of the railroad spur that carried cattle to market and brought supplies from the east, but it thrived on the strict social order that separated the prosperous from the struggling dot. At the top of that order sat Mayor Hutchins, a portly man whose success in land speculation had bought him a 2-story house and the deference of his neighbors. Below him were the merchants like Thomas Thompson, the banker whose crisp suits and gold pocket watch marked him as a man of substance. These were the people who made decisions, who shaped the town's future with their investments and their influence. Then, there were folks like Sarah McKenna, who owned the general store her late husband had built with his own hands. She occupied that middle ground between respectability and struggle, accepted but always aware that her position depended on the town's goodwill. Her store was the heart of Clearwater Junction, where news was shared and opinions formed over sacks of flour and bolts of fabric. Down at the bottom were men like Jake, drifters, day laborers, anyone whose fortunes had turned sour. They lived in boarding houses or slept in the livery stable, taking whatever work they could find and moving on when the welcome wore thin. The town tolerated them because strong backs were always needed, but they were never truly part of the community. Jake had been doing odd jobs for 3 months, saving every penny toward a goal that seemed increasingly impossible. He swept floors at the saloon, loaded wagons at the general store, and helped the blacksmith when his rheumatism flared. The work was honest but temporary, and Jake felt the weight of sideways glances that questioned why a man his age hadn't made something more of himself. The truth was more complicated than appearances suggested. Jake had been born to the saddle, raised by a father who'd learned his craft trailing longhorns from Texas to Kansas. He understood horses in a way that went beyond mere skill. He could read their moods, anticipate their fears, and earn their trust through patience rather than force. But drought had made such talents seem quaint and useless. The world was changing, becoming more mechanical, more focused on efficiency than understanding. This morning was different, though. Today was the monthly livestock auction, and Jake had finally saved enough money to make a bid on a horse. Not much money, barely $12 after paying Mrs. Henderson for his room and board, but enough to buy him a chance at rebuilding his life. He'd spent weeks studying the animals that would be sold, looking for that perfect combination of soundness and affordability that might give him a fresh start. Most of the horses would go for far more than he could afford. The train cutting. Horses and reliable mounts would attract serious bidders with deep pockets. But Jake had learned to see potential where others saw problems, and he hoped that wisdom might serve him well. The auction was set to begin at 10 o'clock, giving the morning coolness a chance to burn off before the serious business commenced. Jake tucked his father's spurs into his vest pocket and walked the 3 blocks to the stockyards where temporary corrals held the day's offerings. The air hummed with activity as buyers examined horses, checking teeth and feeling legs with the practiced touch of experienced horseman. Jake moved among them quietly, listening to conversations and observing the animals with a critical eye. Most of the horses were decent stock, nothing spectacular, but sound and trained for ranch work. They would sell for prices that put them well beyond his reach. But there was one animal that drew his attention like iron filings to a magnet. Thunder stood apart from the other horses, literally and figuratively. At nearly 18 hands high, he towered over every other animal in the yard. His coat was a deep bay, almost black, with powerful muscles that spoke of incredible strength. But it was his eyes that held Jake's attention, dark, intelligent, and filled with a wariness that suggested difficult experiences with humans. The other buyers gave Thunder a wide berth. Jake overheard fragments of conversation that painted a picture of an animal with a dangerous reputation. Through Bill Jenkins, clean into the next county. Nobody's been able to stay on him for more than 10 seconds. Waste of good feed, if you ask me. Yet something about the great horse called to Jake. Perhaps it was the way. Thunder stood slightly apart from the other animals, isolated by his reputation, just as Jake was isolated by his circumstances. Or maybe it was the intelligence he saw in those dark eyes, a quality that suggested the horse's behavior came from understanding rather than mere wildness. As the morning progressed, Jake found himself returning again and again to Thunder's corral. The horse watched him with interest, neither approaching nor retreating, simply observing with the patient attention of a creature that had learned to be cautious. There was no aggression in his posture, no signs of the viciousness that had made him infamous. Instead, Jake sensed something deeper, a loneliness that matched his own. The auction would begin soon, and Jake felt the familiar flutter of nervous anticipation in his stomach. $12 wasn't much in a world where good horses sold for 50 or more, but it was everything he had. The decision he made today would shape his future in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Sarah McKenna appeared at his elbow, her presence announced by the rustle of her blue dress and the faint scent of lavender soap. "Quite a gathering," she said, gesturing toward the crowd of buyers. Jake touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, ma'am. Looks like good stock this time around." Sarah followed his gaze to where Thunder stood in solitary magnificence. "You're not seriously considering that one, are you?" "Jake, I've seen what he's done to riders. Strong men, experienced horsemen. He's not mean, exactly, but he's different," Jake finished. "I know, but sometimes different is exactly what a man needs." The auctioneer's bell began to ring, calling buyers to gather around the platform. Jake felt his father's spurs press against his chest through the fabric of his vest, a reminder of the legacy he carried and the dreams he still harbored. Today would determine whether those dreams had any foundation in reality, or whether they were simply the foolish hopes of a man who'd lost his way. As he walked toward the auction platform, Jake Morrison had no idea that his life was about to change in ways that would test everything he believed about himself, about trust, and about the bonds that could form between two creatures who had both learned to stand alone. The auctioneer's wooden gavel caught the morning light as he raised it above his head, the polished surface gleaming like a judge's gavel about to deliver a verdict. Chester Mullins had been conducting livestock auctions for 15 years, and his booming voice could carry across 3 counties when he put his mind to it. Today, he looked out over the assembled crowd with the satisfaction of a man who knew he had quality stock to sell. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Clearwater Junction's monthly livestock auction, he called out, his words echoing off the surrounding buildings. We've got some fine animals for your consideration today, so let's not waste any daylight. Jake positioned himself near the back of the crowd, close enough to participate, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention to his worn clothes and empty pockets. Around him, serious buyers discussed their strategies in low voices, men with thick wallets and specific needs. He felt like an intruder at a gathering where he didn't belong, but the $12 in his pocket represented hope, and hope was something he couldn't afford to abandon. The first several horses were exactly what Jake had expected, solid working animals that drew spirited bidding from ranchers and freighters. A sturdy Sorrel-Mari went for $38 to a cattle buyer from Phoenix. A matched pair of draft horses brought $62 from a man who planned to use them for hauling timber. Each successful sale drove home the reality of Jake's limited resources, but he waited patiently for his moment. Then the tone shifted. Chester Mullins' voice took on a different quality, part warning and part showmanship, as 2 handlers led Thunder toward the auction ring. The great horse moved with fluid grace despite his size, his hooves striking the packed earth with a deliberate rhythm of controlled power. At 18 hands, he dominated the space, making the sturdy corral fence look fragile by comparison. Now here's something special, folks, Chester announced, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure special was the right word. This here is Thunder, and I guarantee you've never seen his equal in size or spirit. Fine bloodlines, strong as an ox, and built to work. Current owner needs to liquidate his stock due to business circumstances. The crowd's reaction was immediate and telling. Those who knew Thunder's reputation by name exchanged glances and knowing smiles. Newcomers looked impressed by his size until whispered conversations enlightened them. Within moments, the circle of observers had expanded outward, giving the massive horse a respectful berth. Thunder seemed aware of the attention, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with an intelligence that was both remarkable and unsettling. When his gaze reached Jake, it lingered for a moment longer than seemed natural. Jake felt an unexpected connection, as if the horse was trying to communicate something important across the distance between them. Let's start the bidding at $50, Chester called out, his gavel ready to acknowledge the first offer. Silence stretched across the stockyard like a held breath. $50 was a reasonable opening bid for a horse of Thunder's size and breeding, but his reputation preceded him like storm clouds before a tempest. The assembled buyers had seen too many good riders humbled by this particular animal to risk their money on what seemed like an impossible challenge. 45? Chester tried, his voice carrying a note of concern. Come now, folks, look at the size of this animal. He's worth twice that just for his bloodlines. More silence. A few men shifted uncomfortably, clearly tempted by the horse's obvious quality, but deterred by stories of his behavior. Jake watched the scene unfold with growing amazement. In all his years around livestock auctions, he'd never seen an animal of Thunder's caliber generate so little interest. $30, Chester said, his professional composure beginning to crack. Surely someone can see the potential here. That's when Mayor Hutchins decided to have his fun. "Chester," he called out in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe you should ask if anyone's got $20 and a death wish. Might be more realistic." The crowd erupted in laughter, the sound harsh and mocking in the morning air. Jake felt his jaw tighten as he watched Thunder's reaction to the noise. The horse's ears flicked back, not in anger, but in what looked like resignation, as if he'd heard such laughter before and understood what it meant. $25, Chester said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation. "This is quality. Stock, people. Don't let superstition blind you to opportunity." Thomas Thompson, the banker, decided to join the entertainment. "Chester, that horse has put more men in Doc Patterson's office than bad whiskey and bar fights combined." Even $25 seems optimistic. More laughter rippled through the crowd, and Jake felt something shift inside his chest. These people were treating Thunder like a joke, like damaged goods to be mocked rather than understood. The horse stood in the center of their ridicule with a dignity that put his tormentors to shame, and Jake found himself thinking of all the times he'd been the target of similar laughter. $20, Chester called out, his voice now barely concealing his frustration. "Surely someone—" "15, Jake said, his voice cutting through the crowd's amusement like a blade through silk. The laughter died instantly. Heads turned to locate the source of the bid, and Jake felt the weight of dozens of stares as the crowd processed what they'd heard. He stepped forward slightly, making himself visible to the auctioneer while trying to ignore the whispered comments that followed. His movement. $15 from the gentleman in the back, Chester said, relief evident in his voice. "Do I hear 20? The silence that followed was different from before. Not the silence of disinterest, but the silence of disbelief. Jake Morrison, the drifter who swept floors and loaded wagons, was seriously bidding on the most notorious horse in the territory. The absurdity of it struck the crowd like a physical blow. 20, came a voice from the middle of the group. Jake turned to see a young ranch hand grinning at his friends. Might as well make it interesting. 25, Jake responded immediately, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was already over his planned budget, but something about this moment felt too important to abandon. For the sake of $3, the ranch hand's grin faded as he considered the implications of continuing the bidding war. Looking at Thunder, then at Jake, he shook his head and stepped back. "He's all yours, friend. Hope you've got good insurance." Chester looked around hopefully for additional bids, but the crowd's entertainment had turned to concern for Jake's welfare. When no other offers materialized, he raised his gavel with theatrical flourish. $25 once, he called out. $25 twice. The wooden gavel descended with a sharp crack that seemed to echo across the entire stockyard. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $25. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Laughter erupted from every corner of the gathering, cruel and dismissive. Jake heard fragments of commentary that cut deeper than any physical blow. "Poor fool's got a death wish. Hope Mrs. Henderson's got his funeral clothes ready. Easy money, that horse'll kill him inside a week." But as Jake moved through the crowd toward the payment table, fishing coins from his pocket with trembling fingers, he became aware of something else. Thunder had gone completely still, his massive head turned to watch Jake's approach. There was no wildness in those dark eyes now, no trace of the dangerous unpredictability that had made him legendary. Instead, Jake saw something that looked remarkably like gratitude. The payment process was a blur of paperwork and coins changing hands. Jake counted out $25, nearly twice what he planned to spend, and accepted the rope halter. That would allow him to claim his purchase. Around him, the auction continued with other animals, but the crowd's attention kept drifting back to the unlikely pairing of the broken-down cowboy and the giant horse. When Jake finally approached Thunder's pen, the horse moved toward the fence with surprising gentleness. Up close, his size was even more impressive. Jake's hat barely reached the animal's withers. But there was no aggression in Thunder's posture. No signs of the violence that had made him feared throughout the territory. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, extending his hand palm up toward the horse's muzzle. "Looks like we're partners now, whether anybody thinks it's a good idea or not." Thunder lowered his great head and snuffled Jake's palm with surprising delicacy. The gesture was so gentle, so completely at odds with his reputation, that Jake felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Whatever had shaped this horse's behavior in the past, it wasn't meanness or stupidity. It was something more complex, more human than anyone had bothered to understand. As Jake slipped the halter over Thunder's head, he became aware that the laughter around them had gradually faded to whispers. People were watching with a mixture of fascination and dread, waiting for the explosion of violence they expected to witness. But Thunder accepted the halter with calm dignity, his dark eyes never leaving Jake's face. The walk from the auction pen to the livery stable should have been a simple matter of leading a horse 3 blocks down Main Street. Instead, it became a procession that drew spectators from every storefront and side street. Word spread ahead of them like wildfire. Jake Morrison had actually done it, had bought the killer horse that nobody else would touch. Thunder walked beside Jake with measured dignity, his hooves ringing against the packed earth of Main Street. He showed none of the skittishness or resistance that might have been expected from an animal in unfamiliar surroundings. Instead, he seemed to understand that this walk represented a new chapter in his life, just as it did for Jake. By the time they reached Murphy's livery stable, half the town had found excuses to be on Main Street. Jake felt the weight of their stares, heard the whispered bets about how long he'd survive his first attempt to ride Thunder. The wooden gavel that had sealed their partnership seemed to have sealed his fate as well, marking him as either the bravest man in Clearwater Junction or the biggest fool. But as Jake led Thunder into the cool dimness of the stable, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He'd made a commitment today, not just to Thunder but to himself. Whatever came next would test everything he believed about patience, understanding, and the bonds that could form between two creatures who'd both learned to stand alone. The gavel's echo had faded, but its impact would resonate through both their lives in ways that neither man nor horse could yet imagine. The leather halter took shape slowly under Jake's careful hands, each stitch a meditation on patience and craftsmanship. He bought the hide from Murphy at the livery stable, good quality leather that would soften with use but hold its strength for years to come. Working by lamplight in his small room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Jake cut and shaped each piece with the precision his father had taught him, measuring twice and cutting once. This wasn't just another halter. The standard rope halter the auction house had provided was functional but crude, designed to control rather than communicate. What Jake was creating was something different, a piece of equipment that would serve as a bridge between two minds, learning to trust each other. The leather was supple enough to give clear signals without causing discomfort, strong enough to provide security without creating fear. As he worked, Jake found his thoughts drifting to the events of the past week. The auction had taken place on a Monday, and by Tuesday morning, half the town seemed to know the story of his foolish purchase. The other half learned it by Wednesday. By Thursday, complete strangers were offering unsolicited advice about his chances of survival. Some of the commentary came wrapped in genuine concern. Doc Patterson had stopped by the livery stable to remind Jake that his medical services were available day or night, no questions asked. Mrs. Henderson had taken to leaving extra portions at dinner, as if she were feeding a man facing his last meal. Even Sarah McKenna had approached him at the general store with gentle warnings about Thunder's reputation. but most of the attention came seasoned with mockery. Mayor Hutchins had made Jake's purchase the centerpiece of several entertaining speeches at the Cattlemen's Association meeting. Thomas Thompson, the banker, had offered to advance Jake money for a proper headstone before the horse scrambles. Your brain's too badly to make sense. The jokes followed a predictable pattern: poor judgment, inevitable disaster, and the cosmic justice of fools getting their comeuppance. Jake let the words wash over him like rain off a slicker. He'd learned long ago that people's opinions said more about them than about the subjects they criticized. What mattered wasn't what the town thought his decision, but what Thunder thought about him. And that relationship was proving more complex than anyone had anticipated. For the first 3 days, Jake simply sat in Thunder's stall and talked. Not the commanding voice most horsemen used, but the conversational tone he might employ with a neighbor across a fence. He spoke about his father, about the drought that had changed his life, about his hopes for the future. Thunder listened with attention that seemed almost human, his ears forward and his dark eyes focused on Jake's face. On the 4th day, Jake began moving around the stall while he talked, not approaching Thunder directly, but simply sharing the space. The horse watched every movement with interest, but showed no signs of alarm. When Jake accidentally dropped his hat, Thunder took a step forward and snuffled the battered felt with gentle curiosity. By the end of the first week, Thunder was allowing Jake to brush his massive shoulders and neck. The grooming sessions revealed a coat that had been neglected but was fundamentally sound, muscles that spoke of good breeding and better feeding. Under the grime and matted hair was a horse of remarkable quality, exactly what Jake had hoped to find, though not in circumstances he could have imagined. The breakthrough came on Saturday morning, when Jake entered the stall to find Thunder standing with his head lowered, a clear invitation for interaction. Jake approached slowly and placed his hands on either side of the great head, looking directly into those intelligent dark eyes. "I know you've had some bad experiences," he said quietly. "Men who thought they could force you to be something you're not. But that's not what this is about. This is about partnership. Two individuals choosing to work together because it benefits both of us." Thunder's response was subtle but unmistakable. He leaned into Jake's touch, accepting the contact in a way that spoke of developing trust. It was a small gesture, but Jake felt his heart race with the significance of it. This was the foundation every successful partnership was built on: mutual respect and voluntary cooperation. The leather halter was completed that evening, and Jake brought it to the stable early Sunday morning. Murphy was there ahead of him, mucking stalls and preparing feed, his weathered face creased with concern. "Morning, Jake," the old liveryman said, his voice carefully neutral. "How's our notorious guest treating you?" "Like a gentleman," Jake replied, holding up the new halter. "Thought it was time to give him some proper tack." Murphy examined the halter with an expert eye, running his fingers over the stitching and testing the strength of the buckles. "Fine work," he admitted grudgingly. "Your daddy teach you this?" "Among other things." Jake entered Thunder's stall, moving with the confident ease that had developed over the past week. "What do you think, boy? Ready to try something that actually fits?" Thunder stood quietly as Jake removed the rough rope halter and replaced it with the leather one. The fit was perfect, secure without being restrictive, functional without sacrificing comfort. More importantly, Thunder's acceptance of the new equipment was immediate and complete, as if he understood that this represented a step forward in their relationship. "Well, I'll be damned," Murphy muttered, watching the interaction. "Never seen that horse take to anybody like that." Jake adjusted the halter's fit and stepped back to admire his handiwork. The leather complemented Thunder's dark coat beautifully, and the craftsmanship was evident in every carefully placed stitch. But the real test would come when they ventured beyond the safety of the stall. "Feel like taking a walk?" Jake asked, clipping a lead rope to the halter's ring. Thunder's response was immediate. He moved toward the stall door with eager anticipation. Jake opened the gate and led the horse into the stable's main aisle, acutely aware that Murphy was watching every step. This was the moment when most of Thunder's previous encounters with humans had gone wrong, when the confined space of the stall gave way to the open possibilities of freedom. But Thunder walked beside Jake with calm dignity, his massive hooves finding their rhythm on the stable's wooden floor. When they reached the large double doors that opened onto the street, Jake paused to let the horse adjust to the change in light and surroundings. Thunder stood quietly, ears forward, taking in the sights and sounds of the busy town. "Remarkable," Murphy said, his voice filled with genuine amazement. "It's like he's a different animal entirely." Jake felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with partnership. He's the same horse he always was. He just needed someone willing to listen to what he was trying to say. They spent an hour walking the quieter streets of Clearwater Junction, avoiding the main thoroughfare where curious crowds might gather. Thunder's behavior was impeccable, alert and interested, but never nervous or aggressive. He followed Jake's lead with the responsiveness of a well-trained animal, but there was something more in his manner, something that suggested genuine cooperation, rather than mere obedience. When they returned to the stable, Jake found Sarah McKenna waiting for them, her blue dress a bright spot of color in the shadowed interior. She watched their approach with undisguised amazement, her eyes moving from Jake to Thunder and back again. "I heard you were walking him," she said, her voice carrying a note of wonder. "People are talking about it all over town." "People always talk," Jake replied, leading Thunder back into his stall. "Question is whether they're saying anything worth hearing." Sarah moved closer to the stall, studying Thunder with new eyes. The horse regarded her with calm interest, showing none of the volatility his reputation suggested. "He's magnificent," she said quietly. "I can see why you took the chance on him." Jake removed a halter and hung it carefully on a peg beside the stall door. The leather had already begun to conform to Thunder's head, and he could see that it would serve them well in the challenges ahead. Sometimes the best partnerships come from the most unlikely circumstances. As Sarah walked with him toward the stable entrance, Jake felt the satisfaction of progress made and trust earned. The custom halter had been more than a piece of equipment. It had been a declaration of commitment, a tangible sign that this partnership was built to last. Thunder had accepted it not just as a tool of control, but as a symbol of the respect and understanding that would define their relationship. Behind them, Thunder stood in his stall with quiet dignity, the leather halter hanging nearby like a promise of adventures yet to come. The bond between horse and man was still fragile, still developing, but it was real and growing stronger with each passing day. Jake Morrison had made many commitments in his life, but few had felt as important as the promise implied in that carefully crafted piece of leather. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Thunder would face them together, bound not by force or fear, but by the willing partnership that made both of them stronger than they could ever be alone. The thick hemp rope lay, coiled in Jake's hands like a sleeping snake, its rough fibers bearing the weight of tradition and expectation. Every cowboy worth his spurs knew that breaking a horse was fundamentally about establishing dominance. You tied them, hobbled them, and stayed on their back until they accepted that resistance was futile. It was a method as old as the frontier itself, proven by generations of horsemen who'd never questioned its necessity. But as Jake looked at Thunder standing quietly in the morning sunlight of the livery stable's corral, he found himself questioning everything he'd been taught about the relationship between man and horse. 2 weeks had passed since he'd brought Thunder home, and their daily routine had evolved into something that looked more like friendship than ownership. Each morning, Jake would arrive at the stable to find Thunder waiting near the gate of his stall, ears forward and eyes bright with anticipation. They would walk the streets of Clearwater Junction together, Thunder's massive hooves finding their rhythm beside Jake's measured pace. The town's reaction to these walks had shifted from open mockery to bemused curiosity. People still stared, but the laughter had faded as it became clear that Thunder was neither dangerous nor uncontrollable in Jake's presence. Mayor Hutchins had stopped making jokes about funeral arrangements, though he continued to express doubt about Jake's methods. Thomas Thompson, the banker, had taken to watching their morning walks from his office window, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. But walking was one thing. Riding was another entirely, and Jake knew that the true test of their partnership lay in that moment when he would ask Thunder to accept his weight on his back. Traditional methods demanded the use of ropes and restraints, tools that would prevent the horse from throwing his rider while the animal learned that resistance was pointless. Jake hefted the rope again, feeling its weight and remembering his father's lessons about the importance of maintaining control during the braking process. A horse has to know who's boss, his father had always said. Show weakness and they'll take advantage every time. Yet something about Thunder suggested that conventional wisdom might not apply. The horse had never shown aggression, never tested the boundaries of their relationship with anything more challenging than gentle curiosity. His behavior spoke of intelligence and consideration rather than the barely contained wildness that most people associated with unbroken horses. "Morning, Jake." Sarah McKenna's voice interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see her approaching the corral with a wicker basket in her hands. "Thought you might be hungry. It's past 10 o'clock, and Mrs. Henderson said you left without breakfast." Jake accepted the basket gratefully, inhaling the warm scent of fresh biscuits and coffee. "Much obliged. I was so focused on getting here early, I forgot to eat." Sarah studied his face with the perceptive gaze that had made her successful as a merchant. "You're worried about something. Is it Thunder?" Jake gestured toward the rope in his hands. "Time to find out if all this gentle training was worth anything. If I'm going to make a living with this horse, I need to be able to ride him. And you're having second thoughts about your methods?" The question cut straight to the heart of Jake's uncertainty. Every horseman in the territory would tell me to tie him down, hobble his legs, and stay on his back until he gives up fighting. It's worked for thousands of horses over the years. But Jake looked at Thunder, who was watching their conversation with calm interest. "But I keep thinking about what made him unrideable in the first place. What if all those failed attempts weren't about meanness or stupidity? What if they were about fear?" Sarah set her basket on a fence post and moved closer to the corral. Thunder approached the fence without hesitation, lowering his great head so she could scratch behind his ears. The gesture was so natural, so completely at odds with his reputation, that it reinforced Jake's growing conviction that traditional methods might not be appropriate. "What are you thinking of doing instead?" she asked. "Something that probably makes no sense at all." Jake set the rope aside and entered the corral, moving toward Thunder with the easy confidence their weeks together had built. "I'm thinking about asking instead of demanding." Thunder turned toward Jake as he approached, and Jake placed his hands on the horse's powerful neck. The morning sun highlighted the animal's coat, revealing the deep bay color that spoke of excellent breeding. This close, Jake could feel the strength coiled in Thunder's massive frame strength that could easily destroy him if it were used with malicious intent. "What do you think, boy?" Jake murmured, his voice carrying the conversational tone that had become their standard communication. "Ready to take this partnership to the next level?" Thunder's response was subtle but clear. He lowered his head slightly and stepped closer to Jake, a gesture of acceptance that made Jake's heart race with anticipation. This was the moment that would define their relationship, the test that would prove whether trust could replace force as the foundation of their partnership. Jake spent several minutes simply standing beside Thunder, one hand resting on the horse's back. Thunder showed no signs of alarm at the contact, no tension that might indicate resistance to the idea of bearing weight. When Jake finally pressed down gently with his hand, increasing the pressure gradually, Thunder remained calm and attentive. "That's it," Jake said softly. "Just like that." The next step required faith that went beyond mere hope. Jake gripped Thunder's mane with his left hand and placed his right hand on the horse's back, preparing to swing up onto the animal that had defeated every previous rider. But instead of vaulting into the saddle in one quick motion, Jake moved with deliberate slowness, giving Thunder every opportunity to object. He raised his left foot toward Thunder's side, not quite touching, but making his intention clear. Thunder's ears flicked. Back, not in anger but in attention, processing this new development. Jake held the position for several heartbeats, waiting for some sign of acceptance or resistance. When Thunder remained calm, Jake placed his foot against the horse's side and added his weight gradually. Thunder shifted slightly to accommodate the pressure, but showed no signs of alarm. Encouraged, Jake continued the mounting process in stages, each movement telegraphed and deliberate. The moment when his right leg swung over, Thunder's back felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. Jake found himself sitting atop, 18 hands of pure muscle and power, acutely aware that his life depended entirely on Thunder's goodwill. The horse stood perfectly still for a moment, as if processing this new arrangement, and Jake held his breath. Then Thunder took a single step forward, and Jake felt the smooth power of the horse's movement beneath him. It was nothing like the bone-jarring ride he'd expected. Thunder's gait was fluid and controlled, each step placed with conscious precision. Jake squeezed gently with his legs, and Thunder responded by moving into a slow walk around the corral. "Well, I'll be damned," came Murphy's voice from the fence. The old liveryman had appeared without Jake noticing, drawn by the sight of a man actually riding the infamous Thunder. "Never thought I'd see the day." But Jake's attention was focused entirely on the horse beneath him. Thunder was responding to the subtlest cues: a shift in weight, a gentle pressure from Jake's legs. Even the direction of Jake's gaze seemed to influence the horse's movement. It was riding in its purest form, a conversation between two minds that required no harsh bits or spurs to communicate intent. They completed several circuits of the corral at a walk, Thunder's massive hooves finding their rhythm on the packed earth. Jake gradually asked for a faster walk, then a slow trot that demonstrated the horse's incredible smoothness of gait. Each transition was seamless, each change in direction accomplished with minimal input from the rider. Then Thunder stumbled. It was a minor thing. His left front hoof caught slightly on an uneven patch of ground, causing him to break stride for just a moment. But the interruption triggered something in the horse's memory, some echo of past trauma that transformed calm cooperation into explosive panic. Thunder's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. He launched himself skyward in a series of bone-jarring bucks that would have challenged an experienced bronc rider. Jake felt his seat disappear as Thunder's back arched beneath him. The horse's power unleashed in a display of athletic ability that was both magnificent and deadly. The thick hemp rope that Jake had set aside seemed to mock him from its position. By defense, as he fought to stay aboard the hurricane of muscle and motion that Thunder had become. This was the horse that had defeated every previous rider, the animal whose reputation had been built on moments exactly like this one. Jake lasted perhaps 10 seconds before Thunder's momentum finally sent him flying. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs by the impact, and rolled away from the horse's hooves by pure instinct. Pain shot through his left shoulder where he'd landed, and dirt filled his mouth as he struggled to regain his breath. But as Jake lay gasping in the dust, expecting Thunder to continue his display of dominance, something remarkable happened. The horse stopped bucking as suddenly as he'd started, his attention immediately focused on the fallen rider. Thunder approached Jake slowly, his ears forward and his posture free of aggression. By the time Jake had struggled to his feet, Thunder was standing within arm's reach, his dark eyes filled with what looked remarkably like concern. The horse lowered his head and snuffled Jake's shoulder gently, as if checking for injury. "You all right?" Murphy called from the fence, his voice tight with concern. Jake brushed dirt from his clothes and checked his left shoulder gingerly. Bruised, but not broken. He'd been thrown by horses before and would likely be thrown again. But what struck him wasn't the pain of the fall, but Thunder's reaction to it. "I'm fine," Jake replied, never taking his eyes off Thunder, "and I think I understand what happened." Sarah had joined Murphy at the fence, her face pale with worry. "Jake, maybe you should reconsider this approach. The rope method might be safer." "No." Jake placed his hand on Thunder's neck, feeling the tension that still hummed through the horse's muscles. He didn't buck out of meanness, he panicked. Something about that stumble triggered a memory, and instinct took over. Thunder pressed his muzzle against Jake's chest, a gesture so gentle and apologetic that it reinforced Jake's growing understanding of the horse's true nature. This wasn't a vicious animal that enjoyed hurting people. This was a creature carrying emotional scars that ran deeper than anyone had realized. The thick rope lay forgotten in the dust where it had fallen, its presence a reminder of methods that might have worked but would have taught the wrong lessons. Jake looked at it for a long moment, then deliberately turned his back on the traditional approach. "Ready to try again?" he asked Thunder quietly. The horse's response was immediate. He moved closer to Jake and lowered his head in the same gesture of acceptance he'd shown before the first mounting attempt. Whatever had triggered his panic was fading, replaced by the trust that had been building between them for weeks. This time, Jake's mounting was even more careful, each movement telegraphed with exaggerated clarity. Thunder remained calm throughout the process, and when Jake finally settled into position on his back, the horse stood perfectly still. "Take your time," Jake murmured, allowing Thunder to process the situation without pressure. "We've got all day." When Thunder finally moved, it was with the same fluid grace he'd shown before the stumble. They walked the perimeter of the corral several times, Jake's attention focused entirely on reading the horse's mood and responding to the subtlest changes in tension or attitude. The session ended not with conquest, but with mutual satisfaction. Jake dismounted slowly, and Thunder stood quietly beside him as he removed a halter and offered a handful of oats as reward. The horse's acceptance of the treat was calm and dignified, free of the nervousness that had characterized their earlier interaction. As Jake prepared to leave the corral, he glanced once more at the thick rope lying forgotten in the dust. It would have been the conventional choice, the method his father and every other horseman would have recommended. But sometimes convention wasn't enough. Sometimes partnership required the courage to abandon proven methods in favor of understanding. The rope had broken under the strain of Thunder's panic, its fibers separating at the moment when trust might have been destroyed forever. But trust itself had proven stronger than hemp, more reliable than force, and more lasting than any victory achieved through dominance. Jake coiled the broken rope and carried it from the corral, knowing he would never need its like again. Thunder had taught him something valuable about the difference between breaking a horse and building a partnership, and that lesson would guide every interaction between them from this day forward. The blue ribbon felt impossibly delicate between Sarah's fingers as she stood at the edge of the corral, watching Jake and Thunder move together in perfect harmony. The silk had faded slightly over the years, but the gold lettering still proclaimed first place, Ladies Barrel Racing Championship, Tucson Territorial Fair, 1878. It was a memento from another life, when she'd been Sarah Collins instead of Sarah McKenna, when her biggest worry had been whether her Mari Daisy could make the turn around the third barrel without losing precious seconds. 3 weeks had passed since The day Thunder had thrown Jake, and the transformation in both horse and rider was nothing short of remarkable. What had begun as tentative cooperation had evolved into something approaching telepathy. Jake would shift his weight almost imperceptibly, and Thunder would respond with a precision that made their partnership look effortless. They moved, as Pusmos, one entity, bound by understanding rather than equipment, guided by trust rather than force. This morning's riding session had been particularly impressive. Jake had guided Thunder through a series of complex maneuvers that would have challenged any working cowboy-type turns. Sudden stops, backing up in precise increments. Thunder had performed each movement with fluid grace, his massive size. No impediment to the delicate communication flowing between them. Magnificent, Sarah murmured, not realizing she'd spoken aloud until Jake looked in her direction. He rode Thunder over to the fence where she stood, his face glowing with the satisfaction of work well done. 3 weeks of daily riding had restored the confident posture that had been missing since his arrival in Clearwater Junction. Here was a man in his element, doing what he'd been born to do. "Morning, Sarah," Jake said, dismounting with the easy grace that had become second nature. "Didn't expect to see you here so early." "I brought coffee," she replied, gesturing toward the basket at her feet. "Thought you might appreciate something warm after working so hard." Thunder approached the fence and lowered his great head toward Sarah, accepting her gentle touch with the calm dignity that had replaced his former reputation for violence. She scratched behind his ears, marveling at how different he seemed from the feared animal that had dominated local gossip just a month ago. "He trusts you completely," she observed, watching Thunder's relaxed posture. "We trust each other," Jake corrected, accepting the cup of coffee Sarah offered. "Makes all the difference in the world." As they talked, Sarah found herself studying Jake's face, noting the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about Thunder, the unconscious pride in his voice when he described their progress. This was a side of him she'd only glimpsed before. Confident, passionate, fully engaged with life in a way that transformed his entire presence. "Jake," she said suddenly, her decision made, "I have something for you." She pulled the blue ribbon from her pocket, its silk surface catching the morning light. Jake's eyes widened as he recognized what she was holding, and she saw him glance at her face with something approaching wonder. "Sarah, I can't—" "Yes, you can." She pressed the ribbon into his palm, folding his fingers around the delicate silk. "This represents the best ride of my life. The moment when everything came together perfectly between horse and rider. Looking at you and Thunder, I see that same kind of perfection." Jake stared down at the ribbon, clearly overwhelmed by the gesture. "This must mean a great deal to you." "It does. That's why I want you to have it." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she spoke, but pressed on anyway. "You've accomplished something remarkable here, Jake. Not just with Thunder, but with yourself. You've found your way back to who you're meant to be." Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the street. Mayor Hutchins rode into view on his well-fed sorrel, his face wearing the expression of a man bearing important news. Behind him rode 2 other members of the town council, their formal attire suggesting official business. "Morning, Morrison," the mayor called out, reining his horse near the corral fence. "Heard you've been making quite an impression with that animal of yours." Jake pocketed the ribbon and nodded respectfully. "Mayor Hutchins, Councilman, what brings you out so early?" "Glad to see for myself if the stories were true." Hutchins dismounted and approached the fence, his gaze fixed on Thunder with undisguised curiosity. "Tom Wilson was in town yesterday. Said he saw you and that horse working cattle on the Henderson spread. Claims you handled 20 head like they were trained show ponies." "Thunder's got good instincts," Jake replied carefully. "Takes to cattle. Work naturally. Natural enough to handle something more challenging." The mayor's tone carried an undercurrent of serious intent. "Because we might have a proposition for you." Sarah felt a flutter of unease in her stomach. She knew that tone. It was the voice Hutchins used when he was about to present someone with an opportunity that served the town's interests first and the individual's welfare second. What kind of proposition? Jake asked. Hutchins gestured toward his companions. You know Councilman Peters and Councilman Walsh. We've been discussing some concerns about security in the territory. Cattle rustling, specifically. Jake's expression grew more serious. I've heard rumors. More than rumors, I'm afraid. Peters, a lean man with prematurely gray hair, spoke with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. The Morrison Ranch lost 40 head last week. The Crenshaw place is missing nearly 60. Pattern suggests organized activity, Walsh added. Professional rustlers who know the territory and have the manpower to handle large herds. Sarah watched Jake's face carefully, noting the way his jaw tightened at the mention of organized crime. There was something in his expression that suggested personal familiarity with such matters, though she couldn't imagine how a ranch hand would have gained that experience. What does this have to do with me? Jake asked. We need a man who can cover ground quickly and handle himself in difficult situations, Hutchins explained. Someone who knows horses and cattle, but isn't tied down to a specific ranch. The town's prepared to offer a deputy's commission, along with appropriate compensation. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, and Sarah felt her heart race with implications she couldn't fully articulate. Jake as a lawman made perfect sense. His skills, his obvious competence under pressure, the way he'd handled Thunder's transformation from dangerous outcast to trusted partner. But something about the timing felt wrong, as if the town was trying to claim ownership of a man who'd just begun to find his own path. That's quite an offer, Jake said slowly. Mind if I ask why you're not approaching the territorial marshal's office? We did, Walsh replied. They're stretched thin across 3 counties. Told us to handle local problems with local resources. Which brings us back to you, Hutchins continued. You've got the skills we need, and frankly, you've proven yourself. With that horse in ways nobody expected. Shows character and determination. Thunder chose that moment to approach the fence, his massive head appearing over Jake's shoulder like a dark guardian angel. The horse's presence seemed to remind everyone of the remarkable partnership they'd witnessed, the transformation that had made Jake Morrison a man worth considering for important responsibilities. I appreciate the confidence, Jake said, his hand unconsciously reaching up to touch Thunder's muzzle. But I'm not sure I'm the right man for the job. Why don't you think about it? Hutchins suggested, remounting his horse. Take a few days to consider. The town council meets Friday evening. We'd like an answer by then. As the 3 men rode away, Sarah found herself studying Jake's profile, trying to read the emotions playing across his face. The offer was clearly more significant than a simple deputy's commission. It represented acceptance, respectability, a chance to become an integral part of the community that had initially mocked his partnership with Thunder. What are you thinking? She asked quietly. Jake was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Thunder's intelligent eyes. I'm thinking that sometimes opportunities come disguised as complications. And sometimes they're exactly what they appear, to be chances to build the life you want. Is that what you think this is? Sarah chose her words carefully, aware that her answer might influence a decision that would affect both their futures. I think it's a chance for you to use your gifts in service of something larger than yourself, and I think this town would be lucky to have you. Jake pulled the blue ribbon from his pocket and studied its faded silk surface. Your ribbon represents a moment of perfect partnership between horse and rider. What if taking this job means risking that partnership? What if not taking it means wasting the opportunity to expand that partnership into something even more meaningful? The question hung between them as Thunder snorted softly, his breath warm against Jake's neck. Whatever decision Jake made would shape not just his own future, but the futures of everyone who'd come to believe in the power of patience, understanding, and the bonds that could form between unlikely partners. The blue ribbon caught the morning light as Jake held it up, its silk surface reflecting the dawn sky like a promise of possibilities yet to be explored. In 3 days, he would need to give the town council an answer that would determine whether those possibilities became reality or remained forever. Dreams deferred. The wanted poster arrived with the morning mail, its edges yellowed and travel-worn, from its journey through territorial offices and frontier towns. Circuit Judge Harrison unfolded it carefully on his temporary desk in the back room of the general store, studying the crude sketches and detailed descriptions with the methodical attention of a man who'd spent 20 years sorting criminals. From Citizens. Jake happened to be loading supplies when the judge spread the poster on the counter, and something about the sketched faces made him pause in his work. There was a familiarity in the angular features and cold eyes that triggered memories he'd spent months trying to forget. "Trouble coming?" Jake asked, setting down a sack of flour and moving closer to examine the poster. Judge Harrison looked up from his papers, his gray eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. The Hawkins gang, operating out of New Mexico territory that they've been moving north. Cattle rustling, robbery, murder when it suits them. Territorial Marshal's office thinks they might be heading this direction. The name hit Jake like a physical blow, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Marcus Hawkins, the outlaw who'd haunted his dreams for 2 years. The man whose escape had cost Jake his ranger's badge and his partner's life. The sketched face on the poster was older, more weathered than Jake remembered, but the cruel intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable. "Dangerous men?" Jake asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "The worst kind." Harrison's finger traced the text beneath Hawkins' portrait. "Smart enough to plan complex operations, ruthless enough to eliminate witnesses, and experienced enough to stay ahead of the law. They've left a trail of blood across 3 territories." Sarah emerged from behind the counter, her face creased with concern as she studied the poster. "Should we be worried here in Clearwater Junction?" "We're not exactly on the main cattle routes." "That's precisely why we should be worried," the judge replied. "Towns like this, one prosperous enough to be worth robbing, isolated enough to be vulnerable, small enough to intimidate. They're exactly the kind of targets the Hawkins gang prefers." Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the same burden that had driven him to pursue law enforcement in the first place. But alongside that weight came the sharper pain of remembered failure, the moment when Marcus Hawkins had slipped through his fingers, taking with him any chance of justice for the innocent people who died in the gang's wake. "How many men?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. 12, according to our latest intelligence. All experienced gunfighters, all wanted for multiple crimes. The bounty on Hawkins alone is worth $500. Sarah's intake of breath was audible. $500 was more money than most frontier families saw in 2 years. A sum that spoke to both the seriousness of Hawkins' crimes and the desperation of the authorities trying to capture him. "Any idea when they might reach this area?" Jake continued. Judge Harrison folded the poster and tucked it into his coat pocket. "Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how much resistance they encounter along the way, how many opportunities they find to pursue their trade." As the judge gathered his papers and prepared to continue his circuit, Jake found himself studying the faces of everyone in the store. Sarah, arranging inventory with the careful efficiency that had made her business successful. Old Pete Murphy, examining harness leather with the practiced eye of a man who'd worked with horses for 40 years. Mrs. Henderson, counting coins from her morning sales with the satisfaction of honest commerce. These were good people. Honest. People who'd built their lives around the simple expectation that hard work and fair dealing would be rewarded with safety and prosperity. The thought of Marcus Hawkins and his gang descending on them like wolves on a peaceful flock filled Jake with a cold fury that he'd almost forgotten he was capable of feeling. "Penny for your thoughts," Sarah said, approaching him after the judge had left. Jake realized he'd been staring at the empty space where the wanted poster had lain, his hands clenched into fists without his conscious awareness, just thinking about what the judge said. About vulnerable towns and dangerous men. "You're worried about us. I'm worried about all of us." Jake relaxed his hands with conscious effort. Towns like this one, they're not prepared for the kind of violence men like Hawkins can bring. Sarah studied his face with the perceptive gaze that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. "You speak like a man who's dealt with such things before." The observation was uncomfortably accurate, and Jake felt the familiar urge to deflect questions about his past. But looking at Sarah's concerned expression, he found himself wanting to share at least part of the truth. "I've seen what happens when good people are caught unprepared by evil ones," he said carefully. "It's not something you forget." Before Sarah could pursue the subject further, Mayor Hutchins entered the store with the purposeful stride of a man on official business. His face was grim, and Jake suspected he'd already spoken with Judge Harrison about the wanted poster. "Morrison," the mayor said without preamble, "need to speak with you, privately." They walked to the back of the store, near the door that led to Sarah's living quarters. Hutchins glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard, then fixed Jake with a direct stare. "Judge Harrison showed me that poster. Given the timing of our previous conversation, I think you'll understand why I'm concerned." Jake nodded slowly. "You're thinking that offer of a deputy's commission just became more urgent. I'm thinking that fate has a way of forcing decisions before we're ready to make them." Hutchins pulled the folded poster from his pocket and handed it to Jake. "Take another look at what might be facing." Jake unfolded the paper, though he didn't need to study the sketches again. Marcus Hawkins' face was burned into his memory with photographic clarity. The sharp cheekbones, the pale eyes, the scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth. Looking at the poster now, Jake felt the old familiar mixture of determination and dread that had driven him during his years as a Texas Ranger. 12 men, Hutchins continued. Professional criminals with no conscience and nothing to lose. Against that, we've got me, Tom Peters, and maybe 6 other men who can handle a gun well enough to matter. Not good odds. What are you asking me? I'm asking you to think about more than just yourself when you make your decision about that. Deputy's commission. This town needs someone who can stand up to men like these. Someone with the skills and the backbone to protect innocent people. Jake folded the poster and handed it back to the mayor. "And you think I'm that man?" "I think you've already proven yourself with that horse of yours. Showed patience when others would have used force. Showed understanding when others would have given up. Those are the qualities we need in a lawman." The irony wasn't lost on Jake. Here was a man offering him a badge based on the gentle methods he'd used with Thunder, not knowing that Jake had once worn a badge for very different reasons. The gap between perception and reality felt vast, filled with secrets that would change everything if they were ever revealed. "I need more time to think about it," Jake said finally. "Time's a luxury we might not have," Hutchins replied. "But I understand. Just remember, sometimes a man doesn't get to choose his moment to stand up and be counted." As the mayor left the store, Jake found himself alone with his thoughts and the weight of decisions that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. The wanted poster might be folded and out of sight, but the faces it contained continued to haunt his vision like ghosts from a past he'd tried to leave behind. Outside, Thunder waited patiently in the morning sunshine, his presence a reminder of the partnership they built through patience and understanding. The partnership was about to face its greatest test, because the men on that poster wouldn't be impressed by gentle methods or careful communication. When Marcus Hawkins arrived in Clearwater Junction and Jake was certain he would arrive. The only language he would understand was violence. The question that haunted Jake was whether he could embrace that language again without losing the peace he'd found in this quiet frontier town, without destroying the trust he'd built with Thunder, without becoming once more the hard-driven man who'd worn a ranger's badge with such terrible cost. The wanted poster had brought the past into collision with the present, and Jake Morrison would soon discover whether the man he'd become was strong enough to survive the impact. The Silver Star badge lay hidden beneath layers of carefully folded clothes at the bottom of Jake's traveling bag, its metal surface tarnished with neglect and the weight of memories he'd tried to bury. Judge Harrison had been examining it for nearly 10 minutes, turning it over in his hands with the careful attention of a man who understood the significance of what he was seeing. "Texas Rangers," the judge said quietly, reading the inscription around the star's perimeter. "Jacob T. Morrison, commissioned 1875. Jake sat on the edge of his narrow bed in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, watching the judge's face for signs of recognition or judgment. The secret he'd carried for 2 years felt lighter now that it was finally exposed, but the relief was tempered by uncertainty about how the revelation would be received. "That's not a badge you give up lightly," Harrison continued. "Mind telling me why you're not wearing it anymore?" The question Jake had dreaded for months hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. He'd rehearsed various explanations during sleepless nights, crafting stories that would deflect curiosity without revealing the full truth. But sitting here with the judge who'd brought Marcus Hawkins' wanted poster to town, Jake found himself ready to speak honestly for the first time since arriving in Clearwater Junction. "Because I failed," he said simply. "Failed in the worst possible way." Judge Harrison set the badge carefully on the small table beside Jake's bed. "Failure's a broad term, son. What specifically are we talking about?" Jake closed his eyes and let himself remember the events he'd spent months trying to forget. 2 years ago, I was tracking the Hawkins gang through West Texas. They'd hit 3 banks and a payroll shipment, killed 9 people in the process. I had good intelligence about their next target, a small town called Cedar Creek. "I remember reading about Cedar Creek," the judge said softly. "Bad business. The worst." Jake opened his eyes and met Harrison's gaze directly. "I rode in with my partner, Tom Bradley, thinking we could handle 12 outlaws between the two of us. Arrogance. Pure and simple." The judge waited silently, understanding that some stories needed to unfold at their own pace. "We had them cornered in the town bank," Jake continued. "Good position. Civilians cleared from the area. Backup supposedly on the way. Should have been a straightforward arrest, but Hawkins was smarter than we gave him credit for. Jake could still hear the sound of gunfire echoing off the bank's stone walls, still smell the acrid smoke that had filled the street as the situation deteriorated into chaos. Tom Bradley had been positioned across from the bank's main entrance, his rifle trained on the door, when Hawkins had sent 2 men through the back exit. "They flanked us," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hit Tom from behind while I was focused on the front door. By the time I realized what was happening, my partner was down and Hawkins was gone. And Tom Bradley? Dead." The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. "Took 3 bullets in the back while I was congratulating myself on having the situation under control." Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of experience with human tragedy. "How many men have you lost in your career, son?" "Tom was the first, and the last. Because you turned in your badge?" Jake nodded, resigned the next day. "Couldn't face the idea of being responsible for another man's life when I'd proven I couldn't. Protect the partner who trusted me most." The judge reached for the tarnished star and held it up to catch the lamplight streaming through the boarding house window. This badge represents more than just authority, son. It represents the willingness to stand between good people and those who would do them harm. That's not a responsibility you take lightly, which is exactly why I gave it up. Tom Bradley had a wife and 2 children who trusted me to bring him home safe. I failed them in the worst possible way, and Hawkins disappeared into New Mexico territory. We lost his trail completely. Jake felt the familiar bitterness rise in his throat. He's been operating freely for 2 years while Tom Bradley lies in a grave that should have been mine. Judge Harrison set the badge back on the table and leaned forward in his chair. Let me tell you something about Marcus Hawkins, son. In the 20 years I've been riding this circuit, I've seen the damage that man and his gang have done. Cedar Creek wasn't their first mistake, and it won't be their last. They've killed territorial marshals, federal agents, even a Texas Ranger before you. That doesn't make Tom's death any less my fault. Doesn't make it entirely your fault either. The judge's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to weighing evidence and rendering judgment. You made tactical errors, certainly, but Hawkins made the choice to kill your partner. Hawkins pulled the trigger. The distinction felt important, though Jake wasn't sure he was ready to accept it. For 2 years, he carried the full weight of Tom Bradley's death, using guilt as both punishment and protection against the possibility of failing again. Why are you telling me this? Jake asked. Because that wanted poster I showed you yesterday? It's not just a warning about potential trouble heading this way. It's an opportunity for justice that's been delayed too long. The implication hit Jake like a physical blow. You want me to go after him. I want you to consider the possibility that your resignation was premature, that the skills and experience that made you a Texas Ranger didn't disappear just because you took off the badge. Jake looked at the star lying on his table, its surface reflecting the afternoon light streaming through his window. The badge represented everything he'd once believed about his self-competence, integrity, the ability to make a difference in a world where evil often seemed to have the upper hand. But it also represented failure, the terrible moment when his confidence had cost a good man his life. The town council's offering me a deputy's commission, Jake said finally. Mayor Hutchins mentioned that. What are you planning to tell them? I don't know. Jake picked up the badge and felt its familiar weight in his palm. Part of me wants to help these people, to use what I know to protect them from men like Hawkins. But another part of me knows that the last time I tried to be a lawman, someone died because of my mistakes. Judge Harrison stood and moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Son, I've been dispensing justice on this frontier for 2 decades, and I've learned something important about good men and bad decisions. Good men learn from their mistakes. Bad men repeat them. And which kind of man do you think I am? I think you're the kind of man who spent months earning the trust of a horse that everyone else had given up on. I think you're the kind of man who sees potential where others see problems. And I think you're exactly the kind of man this town needs when Marcus Hawkins comes calling. After the judge left, Jake sat alone in his room, turning the badge over in his hands while afternoon. Shadows lengthened across the floor. Outside his window, he could see Thunder standing in the livery stable's corral. The horse's presence a reminder of what could be accomplished through patience and understanding. But Marcus Hawkins wouldn't be won over through gentle methods. He was a predator who understood only strength and violence. A man who would see Jake's newfound peace as weakness to be exploited. Facing him again would require embracing the hard, unforgiving aspects of law enforcement that Jake had tried so desperately to leave behind. The silver star caught the fading light as Jake held it up, its surface reflecting not just the present moment, but the weight of decisions yet to be made. Tomorrow, he would have to give Mayor Hutchins an answer about the deputy's commission. But tonight, he would have to decide whether Jacob T. Morrison, former Texas Ranger, was ready to pin on a badge again and face the man whose escape had haunted his dreams for 2 long years. The badge felt heavier than he remembered, weighted not just with authority, but with the memories of all the times he'd worn it in service of justice. Tom Bradley's death would always be part of that weight. But perhaps Judge Harrison was right. Perhaps it was time to let the dead rest and focus on protecting the living. Outside, thunder nickered softly in the gathering darkness, and Jake found himself wondering whether the partnership they built could survive the transformation that accepting a badge would require. Some changes were inevitable, but the bond they'd forged through trust and understanding might prove stronger than the demands of duty. The revelation of Jake's true identity would spread through Clearwater Junction like wildfire once Judge Harrison shared it with the town council. By tomorrow evening, everyone would know that the quiet drifter who gentled the infamous Thunder was actually a former Texas Ranger with a personal connection to the very outlaws threatening their community. Jake slipped the badge into his vest pocket, feeling its weight settle against his chest like a promise waiting to be kept. The man who'd arrived in Clearwater Junction 3 months ago had been running from his past, seeking anonymity and peace in a place where no one knew his failures. But the man who would face Mayor Hutchins and the town council tomorrow had learned something valuable about the difference between running away and moving forward. Thunder's gentle nicker drifted through the evening air again, and Jake found himself smiling despite the gravity of his situation. Whatever decision he made about the badge, whatever challenges lay ahead with Marcus Hawkins and his gang, he wouldn't face them alone. The partnership he'd built with Thunder had taught him that strength could come from trust as well as force, that the greatest victories were often achieved through understanding rather than dominance. The silver star in his pocket caught the light from his lamp as he prepared for bed, its surface reflecting both the shadows of the past and the possibilities of a future where justice might finally be served. Tomorrow would bring decisions that would shape not just his own destiny, but the fate of everyone in Clearwater Junction who had come to depend on the quiet strength of a man they were only now beginning to truly know. The Colt .45 felt familiar and foreign at the same time in Jake's hands as he lifted it from the bottom of his traveling bag where it had lain wrapped in oiled cloth for 2 years. The weight was exactly as he remembered, balanced, purposeful, designed for the grim work of frontier justice. But his fingers, so gentle and sure when working with Thunder, trembled slightly as he checked the action and examined the barrel for signs of rust or corrosion. The gun had been his father's before it became his, passed down through 2 generations of men who'd understood that sometimes violence was the only language evil understood. Jake had carried it through 3 years as a Texas Ranger, had drawn it in anger exactly 7 times, had fired it in the line of duty on 4 occasions. Each bullet had found its mark. Each shot had been justified, but the weight of those moments had accumulated like sediment in his soul until the day Tom Bradley died, and Jake decided he could no longer bear the responsibility. Now, as he sat on his bed in the pre-dawn darkness of what might be his last peaceful morning in Clearwater Junction, Jake found himself preparing to embrace that responsibility once more. The town council meeting had ended 3 hours ago with Jake's acceptance of the deputy's commission. Mayor Hutchins had administered the oath with unusual solemnity, understanding that they were asking a man to risk his life for people who had only recently stopped laughing at his partnership with Thunder. The silver star now pinned to Jake's vest carried the authority of law and the weight of expectation from a community that had nowhere else to turn. Judge Harrison's intelligence had proven accurate. Marcus Hawkins and his gang were 2 days' ride from Clearwater Junction, moving slowly but steadily toward the town that represented everything they despised about civilized society. They would arrive expecting to find frightened merchants and farmers, easy targets for their particular brand of organized violence. Instead, they would face a former Texas Ranger who had spent 2 years learning hard lessons about patience, partnership, and the difference between justice and revenge. Jake slipped the Colt into its worn leather holster, feeling the familiar weight settle against his hip. The gun belt had been adjusted to accommodate the changes in his body. Months of manual labor had added muscle to his frame, while the peace he'd found in Clearwater Junction had eased the constant tension that had marked his Ranger days. He was still the same man who tracked killers across the Texas frontier, but he was also something more now, tempered by loss and strengthened by the trust of a community that had learned to believe in unlikely partnerships. The knock on his door came exactly when he expected it. Sarah stood in the hallway holding a covered basket, her face pale but determined in the lamplight from his room. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, though they both knew hunger wasn't what had brought her here at 4 in the morning. Jake stepped aside to let her enter, acutely aware of how small his room seemed with both of them in it. Sarah set the basket on his table and turned to face him, her eyes taking in the gun belt, the badge, the transformation of the gentle horse trainer into something harder and more dangerous. "You're really going to do this?" she said quietly. "Town voted me in. Hawkins is coming. Not much choice in the matter." Sarah studied his face in the lamplight, and Jake saw her gaze linger on details that revealed more than he'd intended. The way he'd positioned himself with a clear view of the door, the unconscious check he'd made of the gun's position when she entered, the alert stillness that had replaced his usual relaxed posture. "You've done this before," she observed. "More than just being a deputy. This is something, you know." Jake considered deflecting her observation, maintaining the fiction that had protected him for months. But looking at her face, seeing the trust and concern in her eyes, he found himself unwilling to lie to the woman who'd given him her prized ribbon as a symbol of faith in his abilities. "I was a Texas Ranger for 3 years," he said simply, "before I came here. The 4th under." Sarah absorbed this revelation without surprise, as if some part of her had already suspected the truth. "And Marcus Hawkins? We have history, bad history that needs to be settled." She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, could see the worry lines that had appeared around her eyes during the long evening of preparation and planning. "Jake, whatever happened between you and this man, whatever brought you to our town, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you don't have to face him alone." "Sarah, the men are gathering at the church. 23 of them, including Mayor Hutchins and both councilmen. They're not experienced fighters, but they're good shots and they know this town better than any outlaw ever will." Jake felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same fear that had paralyzed him the day Tom Bradley died. Leading men into battle was a responsibility he'd sworn never to accept again. Yet here was an entire community placing their lives in his hands. "I can't be responsible for getting good men killed," he said. "And we can't be responsible for letting good men face impossible odds alone." Sarah reached up and touched the badge pinned to his vest, her fingers tracing its outline through the fabric. "This star doesn't just give you authority, Jake. It gives you support. People who believe in you, who trust your judgment, who are willing to follow your lead." The weight of the badge felt different under her touch, not just the burden of authority, but the strength that came from community support. Jake thought about Thunder, about the way their partnership had transformed them both through mutual trust and shared purpose. Perhaps leadership could work the same way. "What's the plan?" Sarah asked. Jake moved to his window and looked out at the sleeping town. In 6 hours, the sun would be high enough to reveal Clearwater Junction to approaching riders. In 8 hours, Marcus Hawkins would see the church steeple and the main street that represented everything he wanted to destroy. In 10 hours, the confrontation that had been building for 2 years would finally reach its resolution. "We use what we know and they don't," Jake said. "They're expecting frightened civilians. Instead, they'll find prepared defenders who know every building, every alley, every sightline in town. And Thunder? Jake smiled for the first time since putting on the gun belt. Thunder's going to be the surprise they never see coming. They spent the next hour reviewing the town's layout and discussing defensive positions. Sarah proved to have a tactical mind that complemented Jake's experience, suggesting approaches he might not have considered and identifying weaknesses in the outlaw's likely strategy. Her presence was both comforting and energizing, a reminder that he wasn't facing this challenge as an isolated individual, but as part of a community that had learned to trust each other. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through his window, Jake prepared to leave for the church where the other defenders were waiting. The Colt felt natural on his hip again, the badge solid against his chest, but it was the memory of Sarah's touch and Thunder's gentle trust that gave him the confidence to face whatever the day would bring. The man who walked out of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house that morning was neither the broken drifter who'd arrived 3 months ago nor the hard-edged ranger who'd worn a badge in Texas. He was something new, a leader tempered by loss but strengthened by love, experienced in violence but committed to peace, ready to fight not for revenge but for the protection of people who'd learned to believe in the power of partnership. Marcus Hawkins was coming to Clearwater Junction, expecting to find easy prey. Instead, he would discover that some partnerships were strong enough to stand against any storm, and that a man who'd learned to gentle the wildest horse in the territory might just be capable of taming the most dangerous outlaw as well. The silver star caught the first rays of sunlight as Jake stepped into the street, its surface reflecting not just the light of a new day, but the determination of a man ready to fulfill the promise he'd made to himself and his community. Behind him, Thunder waited in the livery stable, saddled and ready for the partnership that would define both their destinies. The final confrontation was coming, and Jake Morrison, former Texas Ranger, deputy sheriff, and partner to the most remarkable horse in the territory, was ready to meet it head-on. The war bridle was Jake's own design, crafted specifically for the partnership he and Thunder had built over months of patient trust. Unlike the harsh bits and tight nosebands that most cowboys used to control their mounts through pain and pressure, this bridle worked through communication and mutual understanding. The leather was soft against Thunder's face, the bit gentle on his mouth, every strap positioned to enhance rather than restrict the horse's natural responsiveness. As Jake adjusted the bridle's fit in the pre-dawn darkness of the livery stable, Thunder stood with the calm attention of a partner preparing for important work. The horse understood that today was different. Jake's movements carried an urgency that had been absent during their peaceful morning routines, and the men gathering in the street outside spoke in the hushed tones of soldiers preparing for battle. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, running his hands along Thunder's powerful neck. "Today we find out what we're really made of." Thunder turned his great head toward Jake, dark eyes reflecting the lamplight with an intelligence that seemed almost human. In those depths, Jake saw complete trust, the kind of faith that could only be earned through months of patience and honesty. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, Thunder would give everything he had to their partnership. The sound of approaching hoofbeats carried clearly in the still morning air, the rhythm unmistakable to Jake's experienced ear. 12 horses moving at a steady walk, their riders confident enough to approach openly rather than attempting stealth. Marcus Hawkins was announcing his arrival like a king expecting tribute, certain that his reputation would be enough to cow any resistance. Jake swung into the saddle, feeling Thunder's instant response to his weight and movement. The horses, muscles coiled with controlled power, ready to explode into action at Jake's command. They moved as one entity toward the stable door, where the first light of dawn was painting Main Street in shades of gold and shadow. The outlaws appeared, the far end of Main Street, like harbingers of an apocalypse. 12 men mounted on hard-used horses, their clothes dusty from long travel, their weapons worn with the casual familiarity of professional killers. At their head rode Marcus Hawkins, instantly recognizable despite the years that had passed since their last encounter. The scar that ran from his temple to the corner of his mouth caught the morning light, and his pale eyes swept the apparently deserted street with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. Jake felt his breath catch as he recognized the man who'd haunted his nightmares for 2 years. Hawkins looked older, harder, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of violence and cruelty. But there was no mistaking the cold intelligence that had made him one of the most wanted men in the territory. The gang rode slowly down Main Street, their horses' hooves echoing off the wooden buildings like a funeral drum. They passed the general store, the saloon, the bank, each structure apparently empty of defenders. To their eyes, Clearwater Junction looked like exactly what they'd hoped to find: a prosperous but defenseless town ripe for plunder. Anybody. "Home?" Hawkins called out, his voice carrying the mocking tone of a man who enjoyed intimidating the innocent. "We're just passing through, looking for supplies and hospitality." The lie was delivered with practiced ease, but Jake could see the way Hawkins' eyes cataloged potential threats and escape routes. This was a man who'd survived by being prepared for any possibility, who trusted no one and took nothing for granted. "Of course, we'll be needing to see your bank manager," one of the other outlaws added, his words producing harsh laughter from his companions. "Got some business to discuss." Jake nudged Thunder forward, emerging from the shadows between buildings with the deliberate grace that had characterized all their interactions. The great horse's hooves struck the packed earth of Main Street with measured precision, each step announcing their presence with quiet authority. The effect on the outlaws was immediate and electric. 12 sets of eyes fixed on the massive horse and its rider, taking in details that didn't match their expectations. Jake sat Thunder with the easy confidence of a man born to the saddle, his badge catching the morning light, his hand resting casually near the butt of his Colt. But it was Thunder himself who commanded attention 18 hands of controlled power, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. "Well, Hawkins said, his voice carrying a note of genuine interest. "Look what we have here. A real honest-to-God lawman." Jake guided Thunder to a position in the middle of Main Street, directly blocking the gang's path toward the business district. From this vantage point, he could see the entire length of the street while keeping the outlaws in front of him where their movements could be monitored. "Marcus Hawkins," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "You're under arrest for robbery, murder, and about a dozen other crimes I don't have time to list." Hawkins' reaction was swift and telling. His hand moved instinctively toward his gun before stopping as recognition dawned in his pale eyes. "Jake Morrison, thought you were dead. Or maybe just wished you were. Neither one. Just patient." The outlaw leader studied Jake with renewed interest, taking in the badge, the confident posture, the magnificent horse that seemed to radiate barely contained power. "Patience is a virtue, they say. Course, so's knowing when you're outgunned." 12. "Against one does seem unfair," Jake agreed calmly. "For you." Hawkins' laughter was harsh and without humor. "Still got that ranger arrogance, I see. How'd that work out for your partner? What was his name? Bradley?" The mention of Tom Bradley's name hit Jake like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral through sheer force of will. Thunder sensed the tension in his rider and shifted slightly, muscles coiling in preparation for whatever might come. "Tom Bradley was a good man who died because I made mistakes," Jake said quietly. "I've had 2 years to think about those mistakes, Marcus. 2 years to plan how I do things differently. And how's that working out for you?" Jake's answer came in the form of action rather than words. He touched his heels to Thunder's sides, and the great horse responded with explosive power, covering the distance to the nearest outlaw in 3 enormous strides. Before the man could react, Jake had reached down and swept him from his saddle, depositing him in the dust of Main Street with bone-jarring force. The display of horsemanship was so swift and unexpected that the other outlaws were still processing what they'd seen when Jake and Thunder had already moved to a new position. The fallen man groaned and tried to rise, his gun lying in the dirt several feet away where it had fallen during his unceremonious dismounting. "Jesus," one of the outlaws muttered. "What kind of horse is that?" Thunder stood perfectly still, ears forward and eyes bright with the excitement of partnership in action. The bond between horse and rider was so complete that they seemed to share a single mind, anticipating each other's movements with supernatural precision. Hawkins' expression had shifted from casual confidence to sharp attention. "Impressive show, Morrison, but tricks won't save you when the shooting starts." "Who said anything about tricks?" Jake's hand moved to his gun with practiced ease, the motion so smooth and natural that it seemed almost casual. But the speed of the draw was anything but casual. The Colt appeared in his hand with the fluid grace of a striking snake. Its barrel trained on Hawkins' chest before the outlaw leader could blink. The message was clear. Whatever advantages the gang thought they possessed, they were facing a man whose skills had been honed by years of experience and refined by hard-won wisdom. Jake Morrison was no longer the overconfident ranger who'd lost his partner to tactical errors. He was something more dangerous, a seasoned lawman who'd learned the difference between courage and recklessness. Thunder remained perfectly still beneath him, a living platform of controlled power ready to respond to Jake's slightest command. The war bridle that connected them was more than just equipment. It was a symbol of the trust and understanding that made their partnership unbreakable. The first phase of the confrontation was complete, and Marcus Hawkins was beginning to understand that Clearwater Junction would not fall as easily as he'd expected. The bronze church bell's deep voice rolled across Clearwater Junction like thunder from a clear sky, its resonant tone cutting through the tension that had gripped Main Street since the outlaws' arrival. Sarah McKenna stood in the church tower, her hands gripping the bell rope with desperate strength, sending the prearranged signal that would bring the town's defenders from their hiding places. The sound galvanized both sides of the confrontation. Marcus Hawkins' head snapped toward the church tower, his pale eyes narrowing as he realized that his gang had ridden into something far more complex than a simple robbery. Jake felt a surge of pride and gratitude as the bell continued its urgent call. Sarah was exactly where she'd promised to be, exactly when she'd promised to be there. "Well now," Hawkins said, his voice carrying a new edge of respect mixed with danger. "Seems like your little town has some teeth after all." The response came not from Jake, but from the buildings lining Main Street. Windows opened in synchronized precision, revealing the barrels of rifles and shotguns aimed at the mounted outlaws. 23 men emerged from doorways and alleys, their faces grim with determination, their weapons steady in experienced hands. Mayor Hutchins stepped into view near the bank, a double-barreled shotgun cradled in his arms. Thomas Thompson appeared at his office window, a Winchester rifle trained on the nearest outlaw. The transformation was so swift and complete that it left Hawkins' gang stunned and exposed in the middle of the street. What had appeared to be a defenseless town had revealed itself as a carefully prepared trap, with every building offering shelter to defenders and every angle of approach covered by hostile fire. "You were saying something about being outgunned?" Jake asked mildly, his Colt still trained on Hawkins' chest. The outlaw leader's reaction was swift and predictable. Rather than surrender, he chose to fight his way out of the trap, drawing his gun with the fluid speed that had made him legendary throughout the territory. "Kill them all," he shouted to his men. The street erupted in gunfire as 11 outlaws tried to shoot their way through 24 defenders. Muzzle flashes lit the morning air like deadly fireflies, and the sound of gunshots echoed off the buildings in a continuous roar. But the townspeople had the advantages of position and preparation. While the outlaws were caught in the open with nowhere to take cover, Thunder proved his worth in those first chaotic seconds. As bullets whined through the air around them, the great horse responded to Jake's commands with supernatural precision, wheeling and turning to present the smallest possible target while keeping Jake in position to use his gun effectively. Where most horses would have panicked at the sound of gunfire, Thunder seemed to thrive on the excitement, his movements so smooth that Jake could aim and shoot with perfect accuracy despite the violent motion. Jake's first shot took down the outlaw nearest to the church, preventing him from targeting Sarah in the bell tower. His second shot wounded another man who was trying to reach the cover of the blacksmith shop. Each bullet was placed with surgical precision, disabling rather than killing when possible, eliminating threats with lethal force when necessary. But it was Thunder's courage that turned the tide of the battle. When one of the outlaws tried to escape by spurring his horse toward the alley between the general store and the saloon, Thunder responded to Jake's knee pressure by launching himself in pursuit. The great horse's speed was devastating. He covered the distance in 3 massive strides, positioning himself to block the escape route while Jake's colt spoke again. "Behind you!" Sarah's voice rang out from the church tower, and Jake spun. Thunder in time to see Marcus Hawkins bearing down on them, his gun blazing. The outlaw leader had broken away from the main fight, seeking to eliminate the man whose leadership was coordinating the town's defense. Thunder's response was instantaneous. Without waiting for Jake's command, the horse reared on his hind legs, his massive hooves striking out at Hawkins' mount. The outlaw's horse shied violently, throwing off Hawkins' aim and sending his shots wide of their target. Jake used Thunder's movement to his advantage, firing under the horse's neck to put a bullet through Hawkins' shoulder. The outlaw leader cursed and wheeled his horse away, blood streaming down his arm, but his eyes blazed with the fury of a man who refused to accept defeat. The battle was turning in the defenders' favor. Several outlaws were down, their horses milling riderless in the street. Others had dismounted and taken what cover they could find, but the townspeople's crossfire was devastating from their prepared positions. The sound of the bronze bell continued to ring across the chaos. Sarah's signal transformed into a song of victory. But Hawkins wasn't finished. Wounded and desperate, he made one final attempt to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Spurring his horse toward the church, he fired at the bell tower where Sarah was exposed, his bullets chipping splinters from the wooden frame around her. "Sarah!" Jake's shout carried across the gunfire as he saw the danger. Thunder needed no urging. The great horse surged forward with all his strength, covering the distance to the church in a series of ground-eating bounds that would have been impossible for any lesser animal. They reached Hawkins just as he was lining up another shot at the bell tower. Jake launched himself from Thunder's back, tackling the outlaw leader and sending both men crashing to the ground in a tangle of arms and legs. Hawkins' gun went flying, and the 2 men rolled in the dust, each seeking the advantage that would end the fight. Hawkins was wounded but desperate, fighting with the strength of a man who knew that capture meant the gallows. Jake was fresher, but fighting carefully, aware that killing Hawkins would be easier than taking him alive, but determined to see justice done properly this time. The struggle lasted only moments before Jake's superior conditioning told. He pinned Hawkins to the ground and pulled his hands behind his back, reaching for the handcuffs that had been part of his ranger equipment for so many years. "Marcus Hawkins," Jake said, breathing hard from the exertion, "you're under arrest for the murder of Texas Ranger Tom Bradley and about 20 other crimes I can prove in court." The gunfire was dying away as the last of the outlaws either surrendered or fell to the townspeople's accurate shooting. Mayor Hutchins appeared at Jake's shoulder, his shotgun still ready but no longer needed. "Is it over?" he asked. Jake looked around at the scene of their victory, outlaws dead or captured, townspeople emerging from their positions with grins of relief and pride. Thunder standing nearby with the patient dignity that had characterized their entire partnership. "It's over," Jake confirmed, snapping the handcuffs around Hawkins' wrists. For him, anyway. The bronze bell fell silent as Sarah ceased her ringing, but its echoes seemed to linger in the morning air like a promise of peace restored. Clearwater Junction had faced its greatest test and emerged victorious, protected by the partnership between a former Texas Ranger and the most remarkable horse in the territory. Jake looked up at the church tower where Sarah was climbing down from her position, her face glowing with relief and pride. The blue ribbon she'd given him was still tucked safely in his vest pocket, a reminder that the best victories were those achieved through trust, courage, and the willingness to stand together against whatever darkness the world might offer. Thunder approached and nuzzled Jake's shoulder gently, his dark eyes bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. The war bridle had served its purpose perfectly, facilitating communication that had made them more effective than any individual could have been alone. The final confrontation was over, and Marcus Hawkins' reign of terror had ended not with his death, but with his capture. Justice served through partnership rather than vengeance. The Bronze Bell's song would be remembered in Clearwater Junction for generations to come, a reminder of the day when an unlikely alliance between man and horse had saved an entire community from destruction. The new brand burned bright and clean in the forge's orange glow as Jake held the iron steady, watching the JT letters heat to the proper temperature for marking. 6 months had passed since the morning Marcus Hawkins and his gang had ridden into Clearwater Junction expecting easy prey, and found instead a community united in defense of everything they held dear. The events of that day had changed more than just the town's reputation. They had transformed the very soul of the place, binding its people together with shared pride and purpose. Jake withdrew the brand from the coals and examined the glowing letters with satisfaction. Jake and Thunder, a partnership that had begun with laughter and skepticism, but had evolved into something legendary throughout the territory. Stories of the giant horse and his gentle rider traveled from town to town, carried by circuit judges and traveling merchants who'd witnessed the aftermath of the battle that saved Clearwater Junction. "Ready?" Jake asked Thunder, who stood patiently in the corral, his dark coat gleaming with health and contentment. The horse turned his great head toward Jake, ears forward and eyes bright with interest. Thunder had grown even more magnificent. In the months since their confrontation with the outlaws, his frame filling out with muscle earned through honest work on the ranch. Jake had purchased with the reward money from capturing Hawkins' gang. The $5,000 in bounties had been enough to buy good land west of town, complete with a house, barn, and sufficient acreage to support a small herd of cattle. Jake pressed the brand against Thunder's left shoulder, the hot iron searing the JT mark into the horse's coat with a brief hiss and the smell of burnt hair. Thunder stood perfectly still throughout the process, his trust in Jake so complete that even this unfamiliar experience caused him no distress. "There," Jake said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Now it's official. We're partners for life." The brand was more than just a mark of ownership. It was a symbol of the bond that had transformed both their lives. Thunder was no longer the feared outcast that nobody dared approach, and Jake was no longer the broken drifter haunted by past failures. Together, they had become something greater than either could have achieved alone. Sheriff Morrison, the title still felt strange after months of wearing the badge, had proven popular with both the town council and the territorial authorities. His capture of the Hawkins gang had earned him respect throughout the region, but it was his daily work protecting and serving the community that had won him the lasting affection of Clearwater Junction's residents. The badge he wore bore the same star as his old Texas Ranger commission, but it represented something different now, service chosen freely rather than duty imposed by necessity. The sound of approaching footsteps drew Jake's attention to the ranch house, where Sarah was walking toward the corral with a letter in her hand. The simple gold band on her left finger caught the afternoon sunlight, a reminder of the ceremony 3 months ago that had united them as husband and wife. Their wedding had been the social event of the season in Clearwater Junction, with half the territory's officials in attendance to honor the man who'd saved their community and the woman who'd stood by his side through the darkest hours. "Letter from Judge Harrison," Sarah said, joining Jake at the corral fence. "Thought you'd want to read it right away." Jake accepted the envelope and broke the wax seal, unfolding the official document with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read legal papers with suspicion. But as his eyes scanned the judge's familiar handwriting, his expression shifted from wariness to amazement. "What is it?" Sarah asked, noting the change in his demeanor. "Marcus Hawkins was sentenced yesterday," Jake said, his voice carrying a note of wonder. 25 years in the territorial prison. "Judge Harrison says he'll die behind bars, and good riddance." The news should have brought satisfaction, but Jake found himself feeling something more complex sense of closure that went beyond mere justice. Tom Bradley's death had finally been answered, not through vengeance, but through the proper workings of law and evidence. The guilt that had driven Jake from Texas was finally lifting, replaced by the peace that came from knowing he'd done everything possible to set things right. "There's more," Sarah said, reading over his shoulder. "Judge Harrison says the territorial governor wants to meet with you about a position with the Marshal's Service." Jake folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket, then looked out across the land he and Sarah had come to call home. The ranch was small by frontier standards, but perfect for their needs. Close enough to town for Jake to fulfill his duties as sheriff. Large enough to support the cattle operation that would secure their future. Beautiful enough to satisfy the dreams they'd both carried for so long. "What do you think?" Sarah asked quietly. "I think," Jake said, placing his arm around his wife's shoulders, "that some opportunities come at exactly the right time, and others come when you're no longer looking for them." Thunder approached the fence and lowered his head, allowing Sarah to scratch behind his ears with the affection that had developed between them over months of shared experience. The horse had become as much a part of their family as any human member, his presence a constant reminder of what could be accomplished through patience and understanding. "The governor's offer is flattering," Jake continued, "but I've got everything I need right here. A job that matters, land that's ours, and a partner who's taught me more about life than any badge ever could." As if responding to the compliment, Thunder snorted softly and nuzzled Jake's shoulder with gentle affection. The brand on his coat was still tender from the marking, but the JT letters were clear and proud, a permanent symbol of the partnership that had transformed two outcasts into the most respected team in the territory. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Jake of that first morning when he'd counted his last coins at the livestock auction. So much had changed since then. The broken cowboy and the feared horse had found in each other the strength to overcome their separate pasts and build a future worth sharing. "Come on," Sarah said, taking Jake's hand. "Dinner's ready, and I've got something special planned for tonight." As they walked toward the house, Thunder followed them to the fence, his intelligent eyes watching their progress with the contentment of a creature who had found his place in the world. The JT brand on his shoulder caught the last rays of sunlight, its letters glowing like promises kept and dreams fulfilled. Behind them, the town of Clearwater Junction settled into its evening routine, its people secure in the knowledge that their sheriff and his remarkable horse stood ready to protect everything they'd built together. The laughter that had once greeted Jake's purchase of Thunder had long since faded, replaced by respect and admiration for a partnership that had proven the power of trust over force, understanding over dominance. The bronze church bell remained silent in its tower, but its voice would always be remembered as the sound that had rallied a community to victory over those who would have destroyed them. Sarah's blue ribbon lay carefully preserved in a frame on their mantelpiece, honored as the first tangible symbol of the love and support that had sustained them through their darkest hours. As Jake and Sarah reached their front porch, they paused to look back at Thunder, who stood in the corral with the dignity of a king surveying his domain. The horse that had once been dismissed as unrideable had become the foundation of everything they built together. Their love, their home, their place in a community that had learned to value substance over appearances. The JT brand would heal and fade with time, but it would never disappear completely. It would remain as long as Thunder lived, a permanent reminder that the most unlikely partnerships could sometimes prove the strongest. That trust freely given was more powerful than dominance imposed by force, and that a man's true worth was measured not by what he owned, but by what he was willing to sacrifice for those who depended on him. The sun dipped below the horizon as they entered their home, painting the sky in deeper shades of purple and gold. Outside, Thunder settled into his evening routine, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new adventures with the partner who had seen past his fearsome reputation to the gentle heart beneath in the distance. The lights of Clearwater Junction began to twinkle like earthbound stars, each one representing a family whose safety had been purchased with courage and partnership. The town that had once laughed at a poor cowboy's purchase of a giant horse now slept peacefully under the protection of Sheriff Jake Morrison and his legendary Mount Thunder, living proof that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest acts of faith.